Okay, so you're working on a vocal, and the vocal's a little bit thin, and you want to spice things up and maybe add a little bit of depth to it, or a little bit of crunch or dirt to it, or a little bit more depth to it. How do I do that? Should I be using saturation? Should I be using second or third order harmonics? Or should I be using distortion? Or should I be using compression? And what's the difference between saturation, total harmonic distortion, and distortion anyway? Stick around. Okay, so let's jump right into it and get started because we've got a lot of information to cover. I'm going to be showing you a few different visuals, a few different charts, some formulas, things of that nature, just to get to the bottom of what exactly is the difference between saturation, harmonics, second order harmonics, third order harmonics, total harmonic distortion, distortion, compression. There's a big difference between all of these, and I think a lot of folks get them confused and really aren't sure when they should be using which and exactly how to use each. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as usual, I've got my book of notes here. I always keep it handy. This way I don't forget to say anything, and I make sure I cover everything that I wanted to cover with you in this particular video. So to begin, let's start by talking about the differences between the three. And we're going to begin with saturation. Now, what is saturation? Saturation is actually adding second and third order harmonics to a sound. That's what saturation is. Goes a little bit deeper than that, and we're going to get there. Now, I said that it's adding second and third order harmonics to the sound. Well, what are harmonics? Harmonics are either even numbered or odd numbered multiples of the fundamental frequency. Now, what in the world does that mean? I'm going to show this to you on a chart right over here. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to flip the camera over. Okay, so for all you math heads out there, those of you who love math, I went ahead and I put together this formula for you. And we're going to take a look at this very quickly. Don't want to spend too much time here because it does get a little confusing if you're really not that good with math. But just to go ahead and take a look at this, we're taking a look at the formula for total harmonic distortion. And very simply, what this is saying is that total harmonic distortion frequency is equal to, let's look at the denominator first, that V1. That V1 is the fundamental frequency, which is always going to be the first harmonic. We take that first harmonic, and then above it, we're going to put in the harmonic number 2 plus harmonic number 3 plus harmonic number 4. So the formula for total harmonic distortion is V22 plus V32 or 23 plus V24 divided by V1, the fundamental frequency. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there because I know if you're not into math, that's going to be boring. Just wanted to point that out to you so you have a more scientific understanding of what's going on with total harmonic distortion. Okay, so we've briefly touched on saturation and we've briefly touched on total harmonic distortion just to set the ground level here of where we're going with this conversation. So we know again that saturation is adding second and third order harmonics. And we know that those harmonics are going to be created by the saturation. And now we know what the formula is for the total harmonic distortion. Now, when we talk about harmonics, remember we're talking about second order, third order, fourth order, fifth order, sixth order. It goes to infinity. You're never really going to get that high with the work that you're creating, but just keep in mind that it doesn't stop at the fifth or 10th harmonic. It just keeps going. Okay? So bearing that in mind, there are two types of harmonics. You have an even numbered harmonic and you have an odd numbered harmonic. The even numbered harmonics are going to be much smoother, warmer, more pleasant to listen to. They just create that nice warmth that you might want to put on top of a vocal. A third order harmonic, which is an odd number harmonic, is going to create something that's a bit more on the distorted side. It's a bit more crispy, might sound a little bit more tinny. It's definitely going to be more aggressive than applying a second order harmonic. So if you have something like the Solid State Logic Bus Plus, or you have their VHD preamp module, or if you're using the Rupert Neve 542, when you're turning that saturation knob, understand that what you're doing is adding harmonics. And the higher that you go, the higher that harmonic number is going to be. So you're either at harmonic number 2, which is going to be smooth, harmonic number 3, which is going to be more edgy, and then if you go to harmonic number 4, you're increasing the saturation, but harmonic number 4 isn't going to sound as dirty as harmonic number 2 sounded. That's the point that you have to remember when you're using saturation. You're going higher, you're creating more saturation, but you're either going clean, dirty, clean, dirty, clean, dirty, the higher you go with that saturation. So that's something to keep in mind. And also remember, it's very, very subtle. You're not going to hear a tremendous difference unless you're going from saturation to 0 to saturation all the way up to 10. Then yeah, you're going to hear a bit of a difference. Now, that being said, also remember that saturation does two different things. Saturation is going to add that slight distortion, and I emphasize the word slight. It is a very slight distortion because there is a distinct difference between saturation and distortion, which we'll get to in a minute. But saturation is going to add that very slight distortion, and it's going to compress the signal that you're sending to it. Now, that amount of compression is not going to be a lot. It's not like you're using the compressor that you would normally use. It doesn't have that much compression. However, keep in mind that the louder the sound or the signal that you're sending into that saturator, the higher the level of compression that saturator is going to produce becomes. So if you crank up that saturation and it's loud, the signal that you're putting into that saturator is loud, the amount of compression is going to go up. If the signal is very low, the amount of compression isn't going to be as high. So with the saturator, you're adding even and odd harmonics, and you're adding a slight bit of distortion, and you're adding compression depending on how loud the signal is that you're sending into that saturation module or software. Okay? Those are the things I wanted to touch on as far as saturation are concerned, and I hope I didn't miss anything. Let me just go through my notes real quick here. All right. We talked about saturation being a combination of distortion and harmonics. All right, so we've pretty much covered that. Now, the other thing that I want to touch on is the different types of saturation. There are numerous. Okay, you can take saturation up to the point of distortion. And before I go any further, let me go right here where I am right now, because I said I was going to come back to it. Saturation and distortion are two completely different things. Don't get them confused. Don't think that they are the same thing, because they are not. Saturation is going to add warmth and a slight bit of distortion and compression to the signal. Whereas distortion is completely changing the waveform of the sound that you are distorting. It's completely changing it. So there's a big difference. You're not adding any warmth. You are adding distortion, but much heavier distortion. Now, the way to think of this is, if you have saturation and you go from 0 to 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10, you're just saturating that sound more, but you're not distorting it yet. Once you go past the point of high saturation, you now enter the realm of distortion. So saturation from 0 to 10, and once you get to 10, or whatever that number may be, I'm just using 10 as an example here. Once you reach that point of 10 at saturation, you now enter into the area of distortion. They are separate, they are different. And the more you distort, the more you are changing that waveform. Saturation does not change the waveform. Distortion does. Very important to remember that, because back to types of saturation, and there are numerous, but I'm just going to touch on the two most widely used right now, just for the purposes of this video. You have tape saturation and you have tube saturation. The difference between the two is that tape saturation is going to add warmth to the sound because it's going to attenuate the high frequencies. So when you attenuate those high frequencies, bring them down and curve them off a bit at the top, you're losing that snap and that crispiness and that airiness that you get from high frequencies. With a tube saturator, you are lifting up the low frequencies. You're actually more aggressively lifting up the low frequencies. So tape saturation has an effect on the high frequencies. Tube saturation does affect the high frequencies as well, but it is more affecting the lower frequencies, bringing those lower frequencies higher. So that's the difference between tape saturation and tube saturation. And again, it goes deeper than that, but again, for the sake of this video, I'm leaving it there just to keep things nice and simple. Okay, so we've talked about saturation and the different types of saturation, and we've briefly gone into distortion and total harmonic distortion. Let's get back to distortion and discuss that a little bit more. Now, and I've written this down. I want to read it to you as I wrote it down because this is very important and it's going to make it very clear for you. Distortion is going beyond saturation. We just talked about that. Once you're into distortion, you are no longer in saturation. You've gone past saturation. Then you have total harmonic distortion. Total harmonic distortion. Total harmonic distortion, keep this in mind. You are not saturating the harmonics because saturation has created the harmonics. You get that? With total harmonic distortion, you are not saturating the harmonics because the saturator has already created those harmonics. What you're actually doing is you're distorting the harmonics. The harmonics are created by the saturation, and then you go into total harmonic distortion by distorting the harmonics that the saturation has created. 3 different steps there with total harmonic distortion. The harmonics have to be created first. That's what the saturation does. Once the saturation has created the harmonics, you now go beyond harmonics, saturation, which we've already spoken about, and now you enter into the area of distortion, and now you are distorting the harmonics that the saturation has created. So, again, saturation is one thing. Total harmonic distortion is another thing. And distortion is a completely different thing as well. Very important to keep that in mind. Now, there are a couple of modules that are out there. And I'm going to flip back to the screen so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And that would be the Solid State Logic Bus Plus. Now, the Solid State Logic Bus Plus compressor includes both a low THD button and a 4K button as well. Now, the low THD button is obviously low total harmonic distortion. It does exactly as it says. It lowers the amount of the harmonic distortion in the low frequencies. This is what makes that SSL Bus Plus so powerful. You're not just getting a compressor. You're getting a compressor plus the ability to add harmonic distortion, or lower harmonic distortion in the low frequencies, and it gives you 4K mode. That 4K mode gives you 9 different levels of harmonic distortion. So you can go from very slight harmonic distortion to very heavy harmonic distortion. So you're getting a compressor, you're getting harmonic distortion, and you're getting a low THD button to remove from the low frequencies any distortion slightly. It doesn't do it a lot, but it will remove most of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. So that's another thing that you might want to consider if you're looking at that solid state Logic Bus Plus module. Also, you have FabFilter if you're more into software and you're not really into hardware. FabFilter makes a tremendous piece of software. It's called Saturn. Saturn is going to give you saturation and distortion. It gives you that tape distortion, the tape saturation that I spoke about, and it gives you the tube saturation that I spoke about as well, and a host of other types of saturation and distortion on top of that. And I think it's like $169. Trust me, if you want to start working on vocals and adding some depth and warmth and crispiness to them using saturation or distortion on, say, a guitar piece or whatever the case may be, or even a drum, take a look at that Saturn. It's pretty incredible what you get for your money with that FabFilter Saturn. So that's going to wrap it up for today. And again, wanted to just touch on this subject because in the studio, I've heard the terminology used incorrectly so many times, and they apply it correctly, but they use the terminology incorrectly. Let's go ahead and put some distortion on that, and they immediately go to a saturation. Well, you didn't add distortion, you actually added saturation, but in their brain, they know what they're thinking. They're just not using the correct terminology. I've seen it over and over and over and over and over again. Then the understanding of different orders of harmonics. The first order always being that fundamental frequency. Second order, third order, the evens and the odds, and the difference between an even harmonic and an odd harmonic. One is clean, one is aggressive. Need to understand that when you're working with saturation. What are you actually doing to the sound? So these are the things that I wanted to touch on this video. I hope that clears up any questions that you may have had on what is the difference between saturation, distortion, total harmonic distortion, and the host of other things that go along with it. Well, now you know, and I hope this helped. Until next time, G-Sharp Jams out, and as I always say, stay creative, keep creating, and don't forget, if you thought about it and you used it and it worked, it's probably right. So think outside of the box. Don't do everything that the manual tells you to do or some other video on YouTube told you to do. Experiment, try different things. You'll never know what you come up with. And if it sounds good, then it was good. Have a great rest of your day. G-Sharp Jams out.